Today, I'm going to cover one of the wildest cases I think I've ever covered on this channel. And the thing about this story is there are multiple points in the story where you're going to think you know the answer of what happened, but there's always a twist that'll make you question and keep you wondering. Make sure you watch this one until the end because this really is an insane case. And as always, thank you for watching this episode of Storyville. If you're a fan of true crime, mysteries, and strange occurrences, please like this video, subscribe to my channel, and share it with a friend. And now that you've done so, let's open the vault. This is the story of Michael Rockefeller. Michael Rockefeller was born in 1938, and he was raised by a very affluent household. His great-grandfather was the famous John Rockefeller, who is regarded as one of the wealthiest Americans of all time, as he was one of the first to develop a new way of refining crude oil, and he eventually went on to start the Standard Oil Drilling Company. And Michael's father, Nelson Rockefeller, was a New York businessman and politician who was actually the governor of New York City at the time, and he would eventually go on to actually become the 41st Vice President of the United States. So as Michael was growing up, there was a lot of pressure on him to become very affluent and successful like his father and grandfather and many other members of his family. So Michael grew up, and not surprisingly, he was very smart and intellectual, and he was actually very successful in school. And Michael would end up attending Harvard University, where he would graduate in 1961 with the intention of going into politics like his father. But it wasn't long after graduating from Harvard that Michael would develop this keen interest in anthropology and indigenous tribes and their different art forms from different civilizations and cultures around the world. These interests in indigenous tribes and cultures was likely brought on by his father Nelson, who also had a shared interest in these things. Nelson had actually founded and opened an art museum called the Museum of Primitive Art a few years earlier, in which he displayed all different kinds of early artworks made by peoples of the indigenous cultures of Africa, the Americas, Asia, and Oceania. So not long after graduating from Harvard, Michael decides that instead of going directly into politics, which was his original plan, that he would take some time off to travel with a film crew and some anthropologists to different indigenous cultures so he could be around them and experience their culture and also collect art samples for his father's museum. So Michael packed up and he got together the film crew and all of these anthropologists, and they all went down to what was then called Dutch New Guinea and which is now Papua New Guinea, where in Dutch New Guinea there was an indigenous tribe known as the Asmat people. And before we move on with the story, there are a couple things you should know about the Asmat people. The Asmat were extremely primitive, with almost no experience or exposure to the outside world, aside from British and Dutch sailors who would pass through from time to time. They believed that death occurs only through magic or murder, and that spirits of the dead demand vengeance, so death had to be balanced with life, and life had to be balanced with death. So, hypothetically, if two villages in this tribe were to get into a fight and someone from one tribe was killed, it would be customary for the people of the tribe that the person was killed from to go over and they would kill somebody from the adjacent tribe so as to balance out the spirits. And it was also not uncommon for them to practice cannibalism and other tribal rituals. And the Asmat also seemed to believe that life existed within their island, and things that came to the island from over the sea were perceived to be spirits. So on the rare occasions when they would end up making contact with British and Dutch sailors, they would perceive them to be the embodiment of some kind of spirit from over the sea. So when Michael and his film crew and these anthropologists got to the island of Dutch New Guinea, they went up to this Asmat village called Otschanep, where Michael would get the chance to interact with the tribal people and get to know their culture and look at their artwork. And the Asmat people were very accepting and interested in Michael and thought it was interesting that these spirits from over the seas were interested to coming and interacting with them and looking at their artwork. And the people told Michael that it was okay if he wanted to look at and photograph their artwork, but they didn't want him to take any of their stuff off of the island. And Michael said that that was absolutely fine, and he and his film crew, they shot their little documentary thing about the Asmat people and their artwork. And while Michael was there, he began to get rather enamored with the Asmat people's way of life. It was just so different from the way he had grown up living in the West, especially considering that he had grown up in a very affluent household with very well-off family members who had gone to elite universities and all of that. So it was a major culture shock for Michael to go from a place like New York City to somewhere like Dutch New Guinea, where the people spent their time fishing and hunting and gathering and living in these small villages. So while spending some time there with the Asmat people, Michael would take lots of pictures with the Asmat people and their artwork, and while he was there, he would make several diary entries describing how much he liked the Asmat people and how he enjoyed being there. So it was not surprising that after a short trip home to see his family and to resupply, that Michael would soon pack back up with another anthropologist and begin the trip back to Dutch New Guinea to spend more time with the Asmat people. But this is particularly where our story starts to get interesting. You see, on their way back to Dutch New Guinea, Michael and this anthropologist were sailing to the island when they ran into this violent storm which shook their little boat this way and that, and it actually ended up capsizing their boat in the ocean about 12 miles away from the island of Dutch New Guinea. So Michael and this anthropologist had to swim out from underneath the boat and climb up onto the boat, which was now flipped over in the water. And they're just kind of sitting there on top of the hull of this boat wondering what they should do, because they are literally 12 miles away from shore and they don't really have any supplies. Every supply that they had was kind of tipped over with the boat, so they didn't really have much except for a couple gas cans and a couple little supplies, and they had no radio or any way to call for help. So Michael just decides that instead of just sitting on the boat waiting to die, he was going to try to swim the 12 miles to the shores of Dutch New Guinea. So he took some rope and he strapped 2 gas canisters to his legs to kind of act as buoys to keep him afloat, and he thought that he could just use these buoys to float and swim all the way to shore. And meanwhile, while he's doing this, the anthropologist and the 2 guides that they also have with him are telling him, no, you shouldn't do this, we can figure something else out. But Michael was convinced and he thought he could make the swim. So once Michael had gotten the 2 gas canisters secured to his legs, he looked over at his anthropologist and he said, I think I can make it. And then he dove into the water. And officially, those would be the last words Michael ever spoke. And the 3 men that were left on the boat would watch as Michael would swim farther and farther away out of sight, and they would never see him again. Fortunately, after only about 12 hours after they had capsized, another boat actually was on the water, and they saw the anthropologist and the tour guides on their boat, and they were able to come rescue them. But when they said we need to go to shore to see, Michael, they went to shore and they looked for him, and Michael was nowhere to be found. Because the Rockefellers were such a wealthy family, and because Michael was the son of Nelson Rockefeller, who was the governor of New York State at the time, of course Michael's disappearance sparked a massive search. And the Asmat people were terrified, thinking that there was some kind of cosmic justice upon them, as they started seeing hundreds and hundreds of white men running through their jungle yelling out for Michael, and they see helicopters and planes flying overhead, which was something that they had never seen before. I'm sure it definitely freaked out these indigenous tribes. And while the search was going on, the Asmat people kind of retreated into their camps, and they didn't really want to interact with the searchers. And when the searchers used interpreters to ask about, had they seen Michael, they all said, no, we haven't seen him. So after weeks of searching around the island and in the jungle and around the water around the island and having nothing turn up, eventually the search for Michael was called off. Michael was officially declared dead in 1964, with the official cause of death being drowning. The assumption, of course, was that he had either tried to make that 12-mile swim to the shore but had just not made it and drowned because of exhaustion, or that he had been eaten by sharks or crocodiles. And this is where our story ends. But wait, don't click off of this video. As you can see, we're probably only about halfway through it. This is actually where the story starts to get really interesting. This assumption of Michael's death didn't really satisfy the Rockefeller family, who thought that there just had to be a better explanation. So they would actually end up funding a $250,000 reward to anybody who could offer information that would lead to the finding or just discovering of what had actually happened to Michael. And they would also end up hiring a private investigator to just go to the island of New Guinea and find out what had happened to him. Through the reports of what the private investigator found, and also based on the research of an author named Carl Hoffman, who wrote the book called Savage Harvest, which is about the disappearance of Michael Rockefeller, we're able to get a pretty clear picture of what actually happened to Michael. In the weeks leading up to Michael's trip to Dutch New Guinea, two of the Asmat villages actually got into a disagreement with one another that had turned violent. And if you remember, the Asmat believed that death had to be balanced by life, and so it would have been customary for the village who had lost the two members to go over and kill two members of the other village. But this other village did not let this other village come in and carry out this type of justice, so their grievance was just left unsatisfied. And as it would turn out, shortly after this altercation, two of the Asmats from the village who had this grievance were walking along the beach when out of nowhere a white man washed up on the beach and started crawling up onto the shore. So they approached this man and tried to talk to him, but of course Michael didn't have his interpreter with him, so he had to try to communicate with them through gestures and hand signals. At first, these Asmats believed that this was a spirit who had come to them from over the sea, but after a while, as they're talking to Michael, they realized that this was actually a man who had been sent to them from the spirits so that they could balance the scales of life. So then these two men would spear Michael to death on the beach and take his body back to the village. And once they had gotten Michael's body up to the village, they would strip the meat all off of the bones so that they could eat it, and then they would use the bone to use as handles on things like knives and other utilities. And they would also drain Michael's blood out of his body and keep it for a ritual in which they would dance around and sprinkle blood on each other. When the private investigator hired by the Rockefeller family stepped foot on the island of Dutch New Guinea with his interpreter, the interpreter immediately heard the Asmat people say, "Don't tell them about the white man we killed." So the interpreter turned to the private investigator and said, they're talking about a white man that they killed. And the private investigator would end up going up to them and start talking to them about Michael. And long story short, the tribes people would end up admitting to the investigator that they had killed and eaten Michael, and that they had tried to hide it because they thought that those helicopters and all of the people coming from over the sea were some type of punishment for what they had done, so they thought that they had to keep it a secret. News of this event came to two Catholic priests who were actually living amongst the Asmat tribes at this time, and they heard the reports of the Asmat people killing and eating Michael, and these two Catholic priests would actually go out and conduct investigations to see exactly what had happened. And both of these priests would actually write reports of what had happened to Michael and submit those reports to both the Catholic Church and the Dutch government. But the Dutch government would actually end up hiding and covering up these reports, because the same week that Michael was visiting Dutch New Guinea was the same week that the Dutch Minister of Foreign Affairs was meeting with the United Nations to submit a proposal to solidify Dutch New Guinea as a UN-protected Dutch colony. And because Michael Rockefeller was such a prominent figure, being the son of the governor of New York and also being a member of one of the richest families in America, they thought that they of course had to cover up these reports of what had happened to Michael, because they didn't want any complications with America and them being able to accomplish their geopolitical goals. So it would seem that the Dutch government was willing to do anything and everything that it could to stop anybody from finding out what had actually happened to Michael. Even the search party that was employed to go search for Michael was comprised of Dutch soldiers, and there were reports that these soldiers were actually instructed to look for Michael, but if they found any evidence that Michael had come to a gruesome end, that they should cover up that evidence. So there you have it. Michael didn't drown on his 12-mile swim to shore. Rather, he had actually made it to the shore, but he had unfortunately been attacked, killed, and cannibalized by the Asmat tribes. But the details of this had been covered up by the Dutch government because they didn't want any American influence in their international geopolitical dealings with the United Nations. So this is really where our story ends. Except, wait, you're still not at the end of this video. In 1969, a research crew went to the island of Dutch New Guinea to research and film the people there. And in their research, they ended up filming this footage of the Asmat people paddling their boats. Of course, this seems to show nothing of significance, but in 2008, there was a man named Fraser Hetson who was directing a documentary about the disappearance of Michael Rockefeller, and in his research for this documentary, Fraser would actually come across this old footage from 1969. And in a section of this footage, there is a part where it seems to clearly show a white man living among the tribe and practicing their rituals. This footage was taken 8 years after Michael had disappeared off the island, so it led many people to speculate that maybe Michael hadn't drowned in the ocean, and maybe he hadn't been attacked and cannibalized by the Asmat people. Maybe it's possible that Michael had just assimilated into the Asmat tribe and became one of them. It was clear that Michael really did love being around these people, and he didn't really want to be a politician or a businessman like his father and many members of his family, and it was possible that maybe Michael had just wanted to assimilate with the Asmat people. So could it be possible that when the private investigator and his interpreter came up to talk to the Asmat people about the disappearance of Michael, that they had just told them that yes, we killed and ate him as a way to cover for Michael, because Michael was living amongst them and didn't want to be discovered and taken back home? And if he was cannibalized or if he did drown, how do we explain this clear image of a clearly white man living amongst these Asmat people? So there you have it, guys. Thank you for watching another episode by Storyvolt. Go down in the comments right now and tell me what you think happened to Michael Rockefeller. Did he drown like the report says? I mean, it does seem kind of far-fetched that a man would be able to swim for 12 miles without drowning, but he did have the gas cans to use as buoys, and it is possible that he could have survived. Or did he get killed and cannibalized by the indigenous people on the island? This theory definitely makes sense considering what they believed about the balance of spirits and life and death, and these supposed reports that were covered up by the Dutch government. Or did Michael just assimilate into the Asmat tribe without a second thought and without even bothering to contact his family, and thus living out his days in happiness? And if not, how do we explain this photo? Honestly, I don't know, and that's what makes this case so interesting to me, because it seems like there's multiple possibilities that each hold their own merit, but there's really no way to tell exactly what happened to Michael Rockefeller. But that's it for today. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time. But until then, be safe out there.